Gresham College presents The Lost Hospitals of St. Luke's by Professor Nick Black.
Now, if you were to stand on this unprepossessing corner on City Road in 1865, and you were to look west, up City Road, you would have seen 1865, St. Mark's Hospital for Fistula and other diseases of the rectum. You would have also seen the Royal Infirmary for diseases of the chest. You would have seen St. Luke's Workhouse Infirmary. And if you turned through 90 degrees and looked south, you would have seen St. Luke's Hospital for Lunatics and the French Huguenot Hospital. And then finally, if you turned east and looked down the road, you would have seen the City of London Lying In Hospital. And then to come, blocking the view now, is the hospital that you will probably be familiar with, Moorfields, or Royal London Ophthalmic Hospital, which we'll talk about more in a moment, which came about 30 years later. What's extraordinary, I knew nothing about these hospitals, or most of them, until I started digging around and researching. I had no idea that St. Luke's as a district had such richness in hospitals. One thinks of Queen's Square and other areas of London where there's a lot of hospitals, but St. Luke's, I'd barely heard of St. Luke's as a district. We'll come back to that. And what's extraordinary was that all but one of these 7 major hospitals would disappear over the following 130 years, from 1865 through to 2000. And what I want to talk about is, first of all, why were so many hospitals established here before 1900? Why this area of London? 7 major hospitals in such a small area is almost unprecedented. Queen's Square is probably the only other place in London with such a concentration. And then, equally puzzling, why did they all vanish by 2000? Now, for those of you not familiar, as I wasn't really, with that St. Luke's even existed as a district, here it is. So here's the City of London, where we are now, less than a mile north, and today it would probably be referred to as Old Street or City Road. That is the district of St. Luke's, a parish formed in 1733. That's what we're talking about. Go back to the 18th century, and it was quite different from today. That won't surprise you. You're well aware of the developments of London. Here is Old Street, running east-west, going east to Bethnal Green and Essex, west to Clerkenwell, and south down to Moorgate. No sign of City Road. City Road is to come in 1761 and sweep right up here and right through there. But at this time, in the 18th century, this area was orchards, market gardens, and a place of leisure. To the south of St. Luke's, Old Street roundabout is about here, is going to be about here. South of here, we come down here into Moorfields, what was known as Upper Moorfields, Finsbury Square, and Lower Moorfields, Finsbury Circus. And that had been drained, the land there had been drained, and new streets and squares had been laid out as the City of London expanded north, virtually from here, from the city walls upwards, in the 17th and into the 18th century. So what we've got here, as you can see, is fields, market gardens, and a place of recreation. There were some buildings, though. The other thing I should have said was that Moorfields was also the centre of medical London in the 18th century. That's where all the physicians, the surgeons lived. Why? Because the people they depended on for their income, the rich citizens, were in the City of London still. They hadn't started the migration west to the West End, which was to come in the after 1800. Or late 18th century. There were buildings, however, in this area. It wasn't just fields. There were almshouses, such as these. Those of you who were really observant will notice this. Little cafe on the corner, the Shepherdess. because in this area there were alehouses and tea gardens, and this is some evidence of that, because in fact it takes its name from the Shepherd and Shepherdess Inn. Here we see it in 1743, an alehouse and tea garden. There were other pubs and tea gardens. There was the Fountain just across the road from here. But you can see that it's set in a rural landscape. A poem from the Times gives an idea of the life around here. To the shepherd and shepherdess then they go, to tea with their wives for a constant rule, and next cross the road to the Fountain also, and there they all sit, so pleasant and cool, and see, in and out, the folk walk about, and the gentlemen angling in Peerless Pool. Well, Peerless Pool, we can see here, going back to the map, here is Old Street running along east-west here, a bathing pond and a fish pond. This was the Peerless Pond, which actually started life as the Perilous Pond. This was a flooded area where young boys would swim and unfortunately would also drown, hence the name Perilous Pond or Perilous Pool. But then in the 18th century, somebody claimed health benefits from bathing in the water here, and an enterprising jeweller called William Kemp created the Peerless Pool in 1743. Whoops. So there were two ponds, one for bathing, to all gentlemen lovers of swimming and bathing. Women were not allowed. And here you can see them enjoying themselves in this pond. It was 170 feet long, 108 feet wide, and about 3 to 5 feet deep. And it was an open-air swimming pool. There was also angling in the pool alongside. It was also used for some more serious activities. This doesn't show up too well. Here you can see a couple of boats, and they're being tested. This is nautical engineering. This is basically testing the design of boats and which one will have the least friction in the water as it's dragged through the water, testing. Now, there was already one healthcare facility, if we discount the Peerless Pool for its health benefits, and that was the City Pest House. As you'll be aware, the dangers and risks of plague and other infectious diseases in overcrowded cities affected all cities, and pest houses and plague pits, burial grounds were established well outside the city walls, where better than in St. Luke's. And this was the London City Pest House, opened in 1594. On the edge of a churchyard for ease of burial, which can't have been too encouraging when you were admitted to the pest house to have the scene outside of a burial ground, but it would have been the reality for many of the patients. It was paid for from the proceeds of the Spanish Armada, and it could accommodate 200 to 300 people. I presume that there was more to it than this little building, otherwise they wouldn't have got there. Now, by the end of the 17th century, the risk of plague had largely disappeared, and in 1693, a new use was put to the building that had been the pest house, which had been abandoned and was in ruins. The reason it was put to use was the arrival of French Huguenots. In 1685, the Edict of Nantes, which had provided protection for French Protestants from the dominant majority French Catholics, was revoked. And in fear of persecution, as you'll know, the French Protestants, the Huguenots, came to England, as other places, and about 40 to 50,000 Huguenots arrived in London, mostly in Shoreditch and Spitalfields, so very close. Now, they needed healthcare. At that time, what you had was virtually no hospital services at all. You had Bart's, St Bartholomew's, and Thomas's, and Bedlam, which you heard about in a recent talk. But there was very little provision and nothing for foreigners. So Also, the Huguenots were used to, in their own French towns, of providing local hospitals for their own sick members of society. And so they took over the Pest house and turned it into the French Huguenot Hospital in 1693. It wasn't, as you can imagine, great, and fortunately they had a benefactor in Jacob Gibbs, in one of their own rich Huguenot refugees who gave a bequest, and the French hospital, La Providence, designed by Jacob Gibbs, shown here, was erected in 1718. And it's the first example of a hospital for foreigners in London, which was to become a feature. I'm sure you're aware of things like the Italian hospital, the German hospital, and so on that came later. This was really the first major one. There had actually in the 17th century been a Scottish hospital in the city of London for Scots who were foreigners at that time, before Union, and couldn't access Barts or Thomases and so on. It only lasted about a decade. Oops. Right. So, apart from the Huguenot hospital, the French hospital, the question is why now, from 1770 to 1900, were 6 hospitals established in this part of London? And what I want to suggest to you, and show you by example of them, tell you something of each of them, is there's a variety of reasons. The first is the one I've already mentioned, which is that St. Luke's was close by the centre of medical London. The physicians and surgeons' private homes, private practice were just down the road in Moorfields, in what we now think of Finsbury Square, Finsbury Circus, really between here and Old Street. But there were 4 other factors that led to St. Luke's being the place to open up new hospitals. One was cheap land, which offered the opportunity to expand from cramped city quarters. One was to meet local needs. One was the health benefits of the fresh air and sunlight that this sort of rural idyll provided. And the other was transport developments. So what we're going to do is look at each of these in turn. Now, the first, cheap land. As I said, the key thing was 1761, the opening of City Road. The new road, which we now think of as Marylebone Road, Euston Road, Pentonville Road, that connected Paddington through to Islington, was swept through across North London to relieve the congestion essentially on Oxford Street and Holborn, which was the only east-west, or this is the major east-west road that was just snarled up. So the new road was built, if you like, as a bypass, 1756. City Road, 5 years later, was the continuation of that, linking Islington round to the City of London. And 3 hospitals took advantage of the situation of opening up this area. The first was the City of London Lying In Hospital. This had been established just round the corner from here in Aldersgate Street in 1750. Now, doctors did nothing about obstetrics, maternity, whatever you want to call it, up until 1730. And it was really a technology that changed and got doctors, physicians, surgeons interested in childbirth, and that was forceps, which had come from France. They were a closely guarded secret. There was almost like a patent on them because obviously once you had forceps and you knew how to use them, you could advertise and make yourself provide a service and an income. So 1730 we get the start of the man midwives, because remember at this stage all doctors, whether apothecaries, physicians or surgeons, are male. So we get the start of man midwives. The first few set up in terms of a hospital in the Middlesex Hospital, 1745. 5 years later, because they're dominating the Middlesex Hospital, much to the annoyance of all the other doctors, they left and in 1750 set up the first obstetric hospital, the British Lying In Hospital in Covent Garden, and within months, the second one, the City of London Lying In Hospital, here in Shaftesbury House in Aldersgate. That clearly proved inadequate in terms of the demand, and in 1773 the City of London Lying In Hospital was built. If you know Old Street roundabout today, it was right by the roundabout, designed by Robert Milne, and it basically had, in this rather fine building, there were eight bedded wards. And it was a voluntary hospital. In other words, it had to raise its own income from subscribers and from donations and so on. It had to advertise. This is the sort of, there's all sorts, you can find all sorts of documents which are essentially ways of advertising to attract money. It was only, the only women admitted were married, only married women, and at the time, wives of poor industrious tradesmen or distressed housekeepers. So in other words, you had to be the deserving poor. The undeserving poor were not admitted. And one of the attractions was offered was free baptism on the last Sunday of every month. So I guess the church wasn't averse to a little bit of sort of a lost leader to attract new members. The second hospital to take advantage of all this cheap new land that was opened up by City Road was St Luke's Hospital for Lunatics, which I imagine may have been mentioned in the talk on Bedlam. It had been established in 1750 in Finsbury Square, Upper Moorfields, and it was an alternative, the only healthcare available for mental illness, as we would call it now, rather than lunacy, was Bedlam, Royal Bethlehem Hospital, just almost in touching distance of this building, and private madhouses, which tended to be in rural areas, particularly up towards Hoxton and just north of St Luke's. But there was a feeling, which I'm sure again you've heard about, which was that the public exposure of the patients in Bedlam, so it became a Sunday afternoon outing to go and see the mad, the lunatics, behaving in strange ways at Bedlam, was felt not to be appropriate, humane. So St Luke's was set up as the radical alternative. Its first physician was William Batty, who was described as an eccentric humorist. I'm not quite sure what that actually means, although it didn't stop him later becoming president of the Royal College of Physicians, so he can't have been particularly bizarre. This was the building. This is the best representation of it that's left. This is the old thing, not in St Luke's yet. This was designed by George Dance the Elder in 1750, described at the time as a neat but very plain edifice, a building of considerable length, plastered over and whitened, with ranges of small square windows on which no decorations have been bestowed. And although it was enlightened compared with Bedlam, by modern standards we might still feel it wasn't so enlightened, although it's always dangerous to judge earlier periods on our own standards. There was still a large cold plunge bath in the basement in which lunatics would be immersed to shake them out of their insanity, which was used up until, even in the new St Luke's, up until 1856. This was the new St Luke's. That proved too small, the demand was such, and here we are again, Old Road. This is the lying-in hospital, and here's City Road going up to Islington with Old Street roundabout here. And here you see the new St Luke's to replace the old one down in Moorfields, with the male wards on one side, the female on the other, the airing yards for the men and women separately so they could take a stroll outside. And behind here, previously, and when it was built, was still the Peerless Pool, which we looked out onto. It was designed by George Dance the Younger, the son of George Dance the Elder, who was described at the period as he was the most complete poet-architect of his day, which is a rather splendid label to have, a poet-architect. And it was a wonderful building from the outside. It was 500 feet long. It was one of the architecture. This is St Luke's Church down Old Street, which still stands today. Not much else in St Luke's survives from this period. And it was one of the architectural sites of London. It was sort of one of the sort of 6, 7 wonders of London at the time. However, as you can see, very small windows, little lunettes. These were all cells for patients, such that they could only look up and see the sky. They couldn't look out, although they could at the back. There were cells along the front, and at the back there was an open corridor which acted as a sort of day room. And although it's a magnificent building, not everybody shared that view. And I can't give a lecture in 2012 without mentioning Dickens, who I shall mention twice. The first time was in 1851 on Boxing Day, in typical Dickens, rather than perhaps spending it with wife and children, as expect, he visited the hospital. And just one little quote from him, and he wrote about it. He said, "When on that cold, misty, cheerless afternoon, I looked up at the high walls and saw, grimly peering over them, its upper stories and dismal little iron-bound windows, I did not ring the porter's bell in the most cheerful frame of mind." To be fair, he then goes on and talks about really warm Christmas festivities inside with the patients. So his initial impression was not borne out by his experiences he writes about Boxing Day 1851. The third hospital to take advantage of all the space and cheap land was St Mark's Hospital. It had been established also just round the corner here in Aldersgate Street, originally called the Infirmary for the Relief of the Poor afflicted with fistula and other diseases of the rectum. It was known locally as the Fistula Infirmary. Nothing remains of it. It was founded by Frederick Salmon, and like so many specialist hospitals, it was founded by a single doctor who had basically fallen out with the system of the big London general hospitals, Barts, Middlesex, and so on, because these hospitals, in terms of the way they were run, were absolutely rife with nepotism, corruption, and so on. Salmon came from Bath, didn't have the connections, and anybody who didn't have connections did not get on. They were really, whether you got an appointment or not, and it came to a head with him when he and the other doctors actually objected, because they were actually told if you want to get the post, you had to get the vote of governors of the hospital, the voluntary hospitals. And to get the votes of governors, you basically had to buy them. I mean, the thing was, it wasn't about merit in any way as to how good a doctor you were or whether you were suitable for the post. And so virtually all, there were about 60, 70 small specialist hospitals in London. Some became very successful like this one. Others didn't and disappeared after a while. But they were all founded by young, ambitious, innovative doctors who just couldn't make it in the system, and there was big battles, a lot of opposition from the medical establishment against specialist hospitals, which I haven't got time to go into today, but vehement opposition trying to stop it. St Mark's moved from Aldersgate in 1838 just round to Charterhouse Square, but still that wasn't enough, and in 1854 they moved to City Road. And this was the original building. Again, Dickens comes up, because Dickens was one of the benefactors, as he was for many London hospitals, as was William Copeland, the Lord Mayor at the time, Lord Ivor, the Guinness Brewing Empire boss. And essentially, the benefactors largely suffered from these conditions, which were very common given the sort of pretty high meat, low roughage diets of the time. So it wasn't uncommon. But one thing you will note, you probably can't quite read it, but people were not squeamish, their hospitals. So we've got St Mark's Hospital for Fistula, etc., blasted across the front, just as you might have noticed on the Lying In Hospital, so that it obviously wasn't seen as something too off-putting. It continued to thrive, it expanded. By 1896, it had built on the back here, expansion, it was up to 54 beds, and they also, smartly, also recognised the changing nature of the importance of disease and identified cancer was the coming market, if you like. And they started to, and I'll come back to that in a moment, of how they actually started to shift their focus towards bowel cancer. The second reason for new hospital, meeting local needs. There had been a workhouse in St Luke's, south of Old Street from 1733, but in 1782, here's Old Street running up, a new workhouse was built, it continued to expand, and by 1832, the population, you can see all the buildings starting to arrive. This is the Shepherd and Shepherdess pub, which has become the Eagle Tavern, famous in nursery rhyme, Pop Goes the Weasel. And it continued to expand, such that, for the very simple reason that St. Luke's had shifted enormously from that rural idyll of tea gardens and bathing pools. By 1850, St. Luke's was probably the most deprived area of London. We tend to think of St. Giles, around the top of Shaftesbury Avenue, Hogarth's Gin Lane is all set there, as probably as bad as it got in terms of deprivation, poor housing and so on. In fact, there were more people per acre in St. Luke's than even in St. Giles, and certainly where you compare it to some of these other districts. So there's little wonder, and you can see the extent of the housing that's built up. And here's now the workhouse got bigger and bigger over time to respond to that. By 1879, so in 1868, the parish, St. Luke's parish, joined and became part of Holborn and Finsbury Poor Law Union. That also led to the workhouses specialising. So in that union, which obviously covered Holborn, Finsbury, this site became the focus for the sick and infirm. This was the infirmary. The workhouse on Gray's Inn Road became the workhouse for the able-bodied. And you can see the scale of it. This was the new workhouse infirmary, opened in 1879 on City Road. 450 beds in 50-bedded wards. It was enormous. Third reason hospitals moved here was fresh air and sunlight. The Royal Infirmary for Diseases of the Chest. It had been established by, again, an enterprising doctor, Dr. Isaac Buxton, first in Spitalfields, then in Finsbury Square as the Infirmary for Asthma, Consumption and Other Pulmonary Diseases. And remarkably, it was the first specialist chest hospital, not in England, not in Europe, but in the world. It was the first. I think this is grossly under-recognised. This is a really remarkable institution. Buxton faced opposition, as they all did, but he also faced opposition, bizarrely, from an influential doctor, Dr. Thomas Sutton, who wrote 6 times to the Duke of Kent, who was the chair of the board of the governors, trying to persuade them not to go down this route, because what Buxton wanted to do, which was so controversial, was to heat the wards in winter. And there were 2 reasons against this. One was there's no proven benefit. Well, that's probably true. There wasn't in any sort of scientific sense. But also, these people, they'd go back to their miserable hovels, and so they'd almost be worse to give them 2 or 3 weeks of warmth and things. Anyway, it was probably all to do with opposing, because all the specialist hospitals threatened the income of the big general hospitals, so it was much of the opposition. It moved from Finsbury Square in 1849. I haven't got, and I've never found, an illustration of the original building. It must have been very successful, because within 26 years, it had rebuilt to this building, 26 beds. It was seeing 6,000 outpatients a year. Again, the wording along the front. Continued to expand. This is 1885. Here's the building we were just looking at. And here's the big new wing attached. All these voluntary hospitals, general and specialist, would have royalty and aristocracy on their boards as patrons. You wouldn't get anywhere without that. And this particular wing was opened by Princess Henry of Battenberg, who will have, and probably was probably the chair of the Board of Governors. Here's the rather fine-looking ward. You compare that with modern wards in some hospitals. You might feel that we haven't made a lot of progress. And, of course, the ubiquitous and necessary chapel. and they recognised the oldest hospital, they said Europe, because they probably didn't know that actually it was in the world, for diseases of the chest. And you can see the royalty and so on, and the trustees, because part of the reason people would give, somebody like myself would be expected to give money, just as we might become a supporter, a friend of the National Trust or a friend of the Museum of London. You would be expected to become a subscriber to a hospital. And of course, it was quite handy if you've got, there was a chance that you would actually inveigle yourself with royalty and others. And then the final reason for new hospitals here was transport developments. And for this, we take the example of the what was to become Moorfields Hospital. London, 1803, there were virtually no eye hospitals in London. Well, there were no eye hospitals in London before 1805. What we had was itinerant oculists. These were not trained in medicine, surgery, or apothecary. They would be described at the time as quacks. That doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't good at what they did, but they were probably better than anyone else, because nobody else, the medical profession, as it was, weren't interested. The British troops coming back from Egypt, 1803, having been fighting in Napoleonic wars, very high prevalence incidence of eye disease, ophthalmia, and suddenly eye disease took on an additional problem in London. The first was established by one of these oculists, but a few months later, John Cunningham Saunders, a young doctor, established this London dispensary. As you see, eye and ear. At this time, lots of hospitals were to set up eye, ear, nose, throat, different combinations, and then at some point they decided to focus on one or the other. Gray's Inn Road, ear, nose and throat now, was eyes and ears and so on as well. It was just sort of generally sort of sensory organs of the head in general. So it was the second. He sadly died at the age of 37, only 5 years after setting this up. So he was never to know what he created was to become the leading eye hospital in the world. It was so successful that 1822 they moved from Charterhouse Square to Finsbury Square in this building here, designed by Robert Smirke, who also designed many wonderful London buildings, including the British Museum. It gained the name Royal, so it became the Royal London Ophthalmic Infirmary. But there was a problem. Here it is. Here's Finsbury Circus. Here's the hospital, and the side of the square round the circus. 1865, Broad Street Station had been built. It survived that, and the big goods yard, London North Western Railway's goods yard. And even having survived all the disruption and noise of these constructions, then came trams, originally horse-drawn trams. And you can't put horse-drawn trams around narrow streets. So the City of London, not unreasonably, wanting to establish public transport system to get its workers in and out from the emerging suburbs, had to be, the road had to be widened. So they had to move. And they looked for a new site, and where better to move to than, of course, up to St. Luke's. And this is the building many of you will be familiar with. 1898, the Royal London Ophthalmic Hospital arrived here. Originally, not so common nowadays, but certainly I'm sure many of you will remember in sort of 20 years ago, 15 years ago, frequently new NHS hospitals would open and a bunch of the beds had to be mothballed because, well, they'd had the capital, didn't have the revenue to run them. Exactly the same here. There were 140 beds, only 70 could be opened initially. The other interesting thing is this entrance, the main entrance, designed for everybody to go in and out. Once they got here, it was decided that this entrance was too grand for the patients to come through. Only the doctors could come through here. The patients had to go through a side entrance in the little street down the side here. So, whether you feel the right sense of proportions then or... but extraordinary. Okay, so that was all the reasons why they all came. Why did they then very rapidly vanish over the next 100 years? And again, 4 reasons, go through briefly: urbanisation, changing attitude to treatment, World War II bomb damage, and changing medical technology. Urbanisation first. As you'll know, this was the French hospital was a very attractive setting for the Huguenots. It was surrounded by orchards, fields, and so on, rural Idle. But of course, during the 19th century, the city had spread up. It was no longer such a pleasant location. And in 1865, they decided to move. It was principally into long-term care rather than acute care. And they moved and built themselves this sort of Victorian Gothic version of a French chateau just by Victoria Park in Hackney. And they were happily there. Despite its size, apparently it only accommodated 40 women and 20 men, only 60 people, because essentially it was a care home now, rather than anything we would think of as a hospital. By the 1930s, with the start of the London County Council, the LCC had their eye on this site, and they basically were threatening the Huguenots with compulsory purchase. Then along came World War II, and they still owned it. They evacuated it. It got some bomb damage, and although they went back fairly soon after they left, and they went even further. And in 1960, they moved to Rochester. This is La Providence in Rochester today. It's essentially sheltered housing, but it is still only for descendants of Huguenots. Second reason for the vanishing, the changing attitude to treatment. St. Luke's Hospital, this is inside St. Luke's Hospital. These are the sort of entrances to all the cells at the front. This was the sort of the day room corridor at the back. Not terribly clear, unfortunately, this reproduction. But attitudes, of course, to mental illness had changed in the 19th century. And as you'll be aware, the asylums were being built and had started to be built on the outskirts of London, when the word asylum is very much a positive. It was offering asylum, a haven of peace and quiet and greenery and so on, where somebody in a distracted state of mental illness could actually have calm, away from the pressures of urban living. That was before, of course, asylums started to change in people's minds. St. Luke's, like all other mental hospitals in the centre of London, closed in 1914. It wasn't the end of the building, though. The building was sold to the Bank of England, and it served as a print works right up until 1960s. And it was only demolished in 1963, which to my mind, and looking at the audience, I suspect to your mind as well, seems to, even to me, to be like just yesterday. Like it's almost survived to modern times. And it was, it could have been used surely for something. But we lost it. And you can go and see what's there now, but it's nothing worth going to look at. Anyway, it went, nothing remains. What happened to St. Luke's Workhouse Infirmary? Again, the changing attitude to illness. 1930, along with all the other workhouse infirmaries, it became a municipal hospital under the London County Council, with nearly 1,200 beds, 1,100 beds, huge. By 1936, 2 things had happened. It had been reduced in size, it was just too big, and it changed names to St. Matthew's Hospital. It is this was one of the later shifts to calling a hospital after a saint's name, but you'll be familiar, a common practice. But again, to try and get away from the stigma of the workhouse, call it St. Matthew's Hospital. It survived, it became part of the NHS in 1948, by which time halved again, partly because of some bomb damage in the Second World War. Became essentially now it was a geriatric hospital, and it struggled on in that form till 1987, when it was closed and largely demolished. All you can see today, this is what you can see today. Here you can see the girdling wall going round the edge of the site, and this one block, which had been the block for female imbeciles. The rest of it, as you can see, has been either redeveloped or lies sort of vacant as just sort of vacant as a car park. Here you can see part of the girdling wall that went round it, and the HU here on one of these pillars is Holborn Union, from when it was the Holborn Union Workhouse. Third factor was the Luftwaffe. This is just part of one of the rather wonderful maps that were drawn up, obviously rather sad, the subject. So here's City Road. This was the Royal Chest Hospital. St Mark's Hospital is here, untouched, but as you can see, well, you can't see from the scale, but basically the darker the colour, the greater the damage. This meant damage beyond repair. And here you can see the workhouse, which part of it got damaged. So the Royal Hospital for Diseases of the Chest, severely damaged by bombing, and so the inpatients who had been evacuated for the war didn't come back. The outpatients survived until 1954, by which time the building was abandoned and was then demolished. Something does remain, though. This is the nurses' home. The hospital stood here, so it connected with the hospital, built in 1905, and there's one bit of the hospital left, if you're eagle-eyed and go up there, and that's this. That's the last bit, that's all that survives of what was the world's first chest hospital. It's just that little bit of girdling wall. Why it remained, why the builders didn't knock it down, I don't know, but thank goodness they didn't. There's something, just something left. City of London Maternity Hospital also suffered from wartime bombing. First, though, it had suffered from the Northern Line construction, which went right underneath it, and basically the building was then rendered unsafe and had to be demolished. It was replaced, that rather wonderful Robert Milne building, by this building in 1907. It changed name to the London Maternity Hospital, just as a sign of the times. Still looking for resources and subscriptions. Damaged in the Second World War. Meanwhile, the patients had been, the services had been relocated to Hertfordshire. They didn't come back. Some outpatients continued on the site, struggled on, and eventually the building was demolished in 1964. And then finally, changing medical technology has also driven one of the hospitals away. So here's the very successful St Mark's. By 1927, it's starting to expand to the left as well. It had 71 beds. It had also, like many voluntary hospitals, started to welcome people who could pay their own way rather than just the deserving poor who came thanks to the subscribers. By 1930s, it was shifting its focus to cancer, and it was the staff of this hospital who were really instrumental in setting up the British Empire Cancer Campaign, which various mergers later is now Cancer Research UK. 1948, and Aaron Bevan described St Mark's as the jewel in my health service. It was very highly rated, still displaying its the fistula, etc., across the front. But the problem was it was isolated from all other types of medicine. And it was recognised that whilst people had a bowel condition, they also needed perhaps to see a diabetologist, or they needed all sorts of other investigations, and you needed to be part of a general hospital for all the equipment and so on, and the specialist staff. It took 50 years of discussion to actually move, and finally, as some of you will know, it moved to Northwick Park Hospital in northwest London in 1995. It does remain. The whole building's there. This is the original building, now St Mark's Apartments, luxury apartments. The lettering at first I thought had been destroyed, which I thought was terrible, but actually if you look closely, and I checked with the builders, they've simply covered it up. So the lettering, the original lettering is there and could one day be... I presume they covered it because they thought people paying astronomical prices for apartments didn't want fistula, etc. I wonder, though. I'm not sure that would be true, but there we are. Maybe one day they'll take it down and prices will go up even higher. Round the back, you can still see the rather fine nurses' home, built in 1926, and above the door here, the winged lion of St Mark's over the nurses' home, and that survives. The only survivor of all these hospitals in St Luke's is the Royal London Ophthalmic Hospital, which has gone from strength to strength. All the other eye hospitals in London eventually merged into it. It expanded in 1935 with this big extra wing, the King George V extension, with this Eric Gill bas-relief over the door. It didn't go completely unaffected. It did actually get struck by a flying bomb in the war, but it was, and to the extent that some people seriously proposed knocking the whole building down and moving out of London. That didn't prevail, came into the NHS, merged with the Royal Westminster, which is in Trafalgar Square, Central London, which was in Judd Street, and in 1956, after much toing and froing about what to call it, they hit upon Moorfields Eye Hospital, which of course, well, everybody knows it as today, and I think most people, if you ask them where's Moorfields, would point at the hospital. Of course, Moorfields is a quarter of a mile south of there, but there we are. That's just one of those little quirks you can trick people. You can ask people where's Moorfields, and you'll know the answer. And eventually the other sites closed and it came. Okay, so finally, is this just a curious historical tale of these lost hospitals? Well, hopefully you find it curious and interesting. But I think there are two, I wouldn't put it strongly as lessons, but things I take away from this. One is it just highlights the wide range of factors that shape our hospitals, where they're located, how they're configured, how services are configured. We recognise, and I'm sure if I'd asked you, what are the factors that drive what healthcare looks like, you'd have probably said, well, our attitudes to illness change, from infectious disease to mental illness, and therefore we change what we need, and medical technology. If you suddenly need CAT scanners, you need solid concrete floors to put them on, etc., etc. But less recognised are actually just as important, probably in many ways more important, are things way outside healthcare and health and disease: land prices, the physical environment, the other needs for land, war, social policies, and so on. That's one lesson, to understand why we've got the systems we've got. And the other is just that we tend to also think of our health services as being the way they are, as they've always been that way. In fact, it's an incredibly dynamic structure, healthcare, and it's moving all the time, and it'll continue to move. It ebbs and flows across London, shifting with the tides. You'll be aware of all the current debates and discussions about reconfiguring hospitals, and I'm sure we will see a huge further move of amalgamations, of movements out, in and out of London, as policies and views and technologies and land prices change. And as my host mentioned, you can go and see everything I've shown you of what remains, although you might want to hang on because there's a new edition coming out in October, which will be up to date and will have included the sad, unfortunately, there's about 3 hospitals that have been demolished since I published this in 2006. Thank you.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.